It's my privilege to get to introduce today's speaker who will provide our message. I'm so thrilled that we have a wonderful partnership with Luke Air Force Base and our military community, several families here and several that have deployed over the last few years. I'm in conversations constantly with folks in Germany and Afghanistan, Italy, and Las Vegas, and Weatherford, Texas, and a variety of places because we are connected to ministry at Luke Air Force Base. One of the chaplains that guides that is a dear member here. He leads us often in preaching. And so would you help me in giving a wonderful, warm Wellspring welcome to Chaplain David Barnes who provided us this evening.
Well, good morning, Wellspring. It's good to be back with you, an honor to be sharing with you. And you might be wondering, why are we showing a movie trailer in church this morning? Well, I saw that movie not too long ago. By the way, it's March a year or two ago, not this spring. But I saw that movie, Do You Believe, a while ago, and it follows the lives of 12 people, seemingly random people, that in the end, their lives are interconnected in a unique way in certain circumstances. And since watching that movie, God has been speaking to me about how He orchestrates and how He orders our lives. It was a reminder to me of the truth of Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 24. It's a truth that I think we all need to focus on this morning, because the truth of this verse is life-transforming. The truth of this verse is a mighty weapon for us against our adversary, Satan. Because you see, that Satan knows the power of this truth. And he tries to get us to doubt it. He tries to get us to doubt it in our lives so that we will live defeated lives apart from God. You see, Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 24 says that a man's steps are directed by the Lord. How then can we understand his own way? What a powerful verse. What a powerful verse for you and me this morning, because the truth of this passage, the truth of this verse is that God guides and directs the steps of your life. That God guides and directs the steps of my life. That verse asks a question in the second half of it. And the answer to that question that it asks is found in the first half of the verse. How do I understand the way of my life? I understand the way of my life by understanding that God directs the steps of my life. And when I understand that truth, and then I start asking myself the questions like, God, what am I to learn from this experience that I'm going through? God, why did you bring this person into my life today? God, why did my schedule change? Was there a reason for it? God, why am I experiencing this painful event in my life? Is this experience about me? Or are you using me in order to impact the life of someone else? And when you and I understand the truth that God directs the steps of our lives, when we understand that truth, and then we begin to seek to understand how God is working in the circumstances and the events of our lives, we begin to find hope. We begin to find meaning and purpose and direction in life when we begin to understand that truth. We may not know why God is doing something. We may not know why God is allowing something to come into our lives. And we may not know why we are experiencing the pain that we are experiencing. But you need to hear this, that there is strength. There is hope. There is encouragement. There's light at the end of the tunnel, knowing that God directs our steps. Even if I don't understand why. And that is a truth that will set you free. When you can understand that God is directing the steps of your life, you may not understand why things are happening, but you know that God is in control. Because when we try to understand the way of our lives, apart from God, on our own, it leads to despair. It leads to a feeling of hopelessness. It leads to stress. It leads to an unhealthy worldview. And frankly, it leads to sin in our lives. Proverbs has another verse that is applicable here. It says, "There's a way that seems right to man, but in the end it leads to death." You see, when you and I try to figure things out on our own, when we try to figure out on our own apart from God, we begin to lose focus. We lose perspective. And Satan, our adversary, he knows that. He knows that truth, and he begins to raise doubt in our lives about God's love for us. And he begins to get us to question what is going on in the circumstances of our lives. He begins to get us to question God's provision in our lives. He convinces us that we should rely on our own wisdom instead of the wisdom of God. But you need to hear the truth this morning. You need to hear the truth that a man's steps are directed of the Lord. My steps, your steps, everyone's steps are directed by the Lord. And listen, even the steps of the godless are directed by the Lord. Because the Lord Jehovah reigns over all of creation, not just a part of it, but he reigns over all of it. He can guide the things that take place in the lives of believers, and he guides the things that takes place in the lives of unbelievers so that his will and his purpose and his plan will be accomplished. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 24 is a truth that we need to focus on. It's a truth that can change our lives as we begin to understand and begin to seek to understand how God is working in our lives. I want to take a few minutes to share with you some experiences in my life as I think about them and how God has ordered those steps to accomplish his purpose, to accomplish his will. You see, while I was deployed in Kandahar, Afghanistan, I randomly found a DVD while I was in a medical clinic visiting with my friend Doc Matthews. I found this DVD and it was entitled "Faith Like Potatoes." The title of the movie caught my attention. It was a strange title for a movie, so I picked it up and I took it back to my room and watched this movie. And it was the true story of a struggling South African farmer by the name of Angus Buchan, who accepted Christ and basically after his conversion, after he came to Christ, he just became truly an evangelist there in South Africa. And in the midst of a drought, Angus felt like God was telling him that he needed to plant some potatoes. And everybody that knew anything about farming and the drought that was going on told him, "You can't plant potatoes. It's crazy. Don't do it. You're gonna completely go under." But Angus felt like God was telling him to do it. And so as a show of faith and trying to build faith in the community and the people around that he was trying to encourage and tell them that our God is a mighty God, he planted those potatoes. And when the harvest came, there was an abundance of potatoes and they were huge. But that's not why I'm telling you the story this morning. You see, I'm telling you the story this morning because 2 months after I watched that movie, I traveled from Kandahar up to the northwest corner of Afghanistan to a Herat air base. And just even the fact that I was going from Kandahar to Herat in itself was just something that wasn't supposed to have taken place. And so I saw the movement there of God as well. But by chance, I ended up bunking in a tiny little compound with dogs that are trained to find explosives. I had my own room. I wasn't in the kennel, but I was with them. And the kennel master was Air Force member, but the 3 dog handlers were civilian contractors. And that's where I met Dion. Dion was from South Africa. He had been a police officer in South Africa for 33 years. Until one day he was involved in a car accident chasing a suspect and ended up having to have back surgeries and all kinds of stuff and was in a wheelchair for 9 months, and he decided it was time to change occupations, time to change jobs, and that's when he decided he'd become a handler for explosive detection dogs. And that's what ultimately brought him to Afghanistan. When I met Dion, he had been married for 36 years, and he was about to retire, and he was going to go home and begin farming on this plot of land that he inherited. And when he told me that, I said, hey, I saw this movie a couple months ago about this guy from South Africa and this farmer, and I started to tell him the story, and he goes, Angus. Angus, he's huge. He's a true evangelist. And he started telling me all this stuff about Angus and his ministry in South Africa. And then he said, I've even been to his farm. I couldn't believe my ears that here's this guy, he's been to the farm. And he started telling me that Angus began to hold these big men's conferences and thousands of men would come. He said, I went 3 years in a row. He said thousands and thousands of men would come. We'd camp out on his farm and he'd speak, and it was just amazing. And eventually they had to quit having him because so many thousands of men came. It just overwhelmed the little community, and I guess people complained. But anyway, he was getting goosebumps as he was telling me about Angus and his ministry. And to this day, I marvel at this random connection that took place, a connection that I really believe was God ordering my steps and the steps of Dion for some reason. I don't know why, but I believe that God ordered those steps. I mean, think about it. Randomly finding this movie in Afghanistan, and then in a totally different place in Afghanistan, I meet this guy named Dion from South Africa who knew the guy that the movie was about, and he'd even been to the farm. That's a God thing. That's a God thing. I don't know why, but I feel like it was what God intended, but it was God ordered my steps. God ordered Dion's steps. I don't know if it was for me. I don't know if it was for Dion. We spoke for a couple hours that day about a lot of stuff. But I know that God encouraged my faith as a result of that encounter, of that meeting with Dion. I also work with Phoenix Children's Hospital as an on-call chaplain. And a few weeks ago, one of the on-call chaplains called and had a death in the family and asked if I could take the pager for the weekend, and I said sure. And that Sunday, I got a phone call from the hospital. 17-year-old girl was asking to speak to the chaplain. And so I went to the hospital to meet this young lady. I'll call her Eileen. When I walked in the room, I introduced myself to Eileen and to her father and had a few pleasantries, and then her father got up and excused himself so that Eileen could talk to me privately. And as I asked her what was going on, tears came to her eyes. And she said, why is God doing this? Why is God doing this? You see, 20 days earlier, Eileen was living a life of any other 17-year-old girl. She was in her room about 8:30 at night watching movies. And all of a sudden, she had a sharp pain in her back. I mean, so painful that she got up and she went to her mom and dad and told them that she's got this pain that's going on. And her mom and dad, like all of us, as if you're a parent, it's all right. You comfort them, go take some Motrin, go to bed. It'll be gone in the morning kind of thing. About 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, Eileen wakes up in just severe pain. Excruciating pain, and she gets up to go tell her mom and dad, and she falls to the floor because she has no strength, no muscle strength in her legs. She can't control her legs. And she lays on the ground for about 30 minutes trying to get somebody's attention to come and help her. To make a long story short, some kind of virus attacked her spine and her nervous system. It's a fairly rare disease that attacks the body's ability to control the muscles by damaging the nerves in your body. Had she not been able to get her parents' attention, she likely would have died in her room that night as the nerves gradually worked their way up from her legs, which ultimately it did. I mean, she's in a hospital and she had no control of her legs. She had no control really of her arms. And eventually she had to be put on the trach to control her breathing and stuff for a while until they're able to get the infection under control. Why is God doing this? She asked through tearful eyes. Eileen is a believer. She's very active in her church youth group. And she had been praying, asking the why question, and she felt alone, abandoned by God. As if he wasn't listening to her because of the circumstances in her life were beginning to make her feel that way. It was a question that had been weighing heavy on her heart, and she was trying to reconcile her faith and the circumstances that she was experiencing in her life. In Proverbs 20, it asks, "How then can anyone understand his own way?" Eileen, God didn't look down from heaven one day and say, "Oh, there's Eileen, and I'm going to zap you with this terrible affliction." No, we live in a fallen, sinful world, and sickness and the disease is a part of that and attacks the strongest believer and the vilest sinner. Eileen, God hears your prayers, and He's working in your life even as we speak. You know, it's the devil that is whispering in your ear that God did this to you. It's the devil that doesn't want you to know that God is hearing your prayers. He's the one who is raising these questions in your mind, asking, how could God do this? And then Eileen and I began to talk about this guy named Job in the Bible, who Job, like Eileen, had faith. But the voices of others were raising the same kind of questions in his life that Eileen was going through in her life. And then we talked about some of the great people of faith who had gone through difficult trials and times in their lives, and how God had been with them through each of those times and how He hadn't abandoned them. We talked about Paul, who was beaten and almost killed and thrown in prison, and because God was with him and because of his faith, he wrote most of the New Testaments. We talked about Daniel, who had been thrown into the lion's den, and God was with him and didn't abandon him and shut the mouths of the lions. We talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were thrown into the fiery furnace because of their faith, and God didn't abandon them, but God was there with them in the midst of the fire, in the midst of that furnace, and saved them. God directed their steps so that His will would be accomplished in their lives. He didn't cause the events. And now hear me this morning. God did not cause the events that put Paul in prison and had him beaten. God didn't cause the events that put Daniel in the lion's den. God didn't cause the events that put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Sinful man and the choices of sinful man put each of these great people of faith in the perilous conditions in which they were found, and God was with them to accomplish His will and His purpose in their lives. Eileen, in the midst of this prison, in the midst of this lion's den, in the midst of this furnace, God is with you. And all you need is a little bit of faith. And you're going to begin to see God do some mighty things in your life. And I pulled out my cell phone, and I pulled up the Mercy Me song, Even If. And I played that song for her to remind her that, Eileen, you just need a little bit of faith. And with that little bit of faith, God will give you the strength and the encouragement that you need. And Eileen played that song multiple times. In fact, her family started to listen to that song and found encouragement from that song. I met Eileen with tears and a heavy heart. And I left a young lady with a smile and a hope that the God who had uniquely created her still had a purpose and had a plan for her life, that He had not forgotten her. A week later, Eileen's mother said to me that God did something in Eileen's heart that day. On that Sunday, God had done something, because ever since, she said, there's just something different about her. Her whole personality, her whole countenance is different. And every time I saw Eileen after that, she would just light up with a smile. She awakened something within me, in my heart, about trusting in God and walking by faith. I took Eileen that movie. It reminded me of the movie Faith Like Potatoes. I took her that movie and encouraged her to watch it. And I said, I want you to watch this movie, and I want you to look the next time we talk and tell me about 2 or 3 times in this movie where faith is required. She has potato-like faith. You got to watch the movie. You see, I could have said, I got the pager, and a call went off. I responded. That's it. There's nothing more to it than that, but I can't. Because I've never had a call like that at the hospital before. I truly believe that it was a divine appointment orchestrated by God. The fact that I was on call that weekend, the fact that she asked that day to talk to a chaplain and not a day or two earlier when she started to really feel like she needed to talk to somebody. And the whole connection that was there between the two of us. I don't know. It just feels different. It feels special. It feels meant to be. I don't know who ministered to who, but even her parents were strengthened through this whole thing, that their faith was encouraged and made stronger. Our God is an awesome God. Who can understand Him? You have to know, Eileen's going to watch this in a couple days when they put it on the internet. Today, Eileen is going to be watching this from her home because Friday she was able to leave the hospital on day 40 of being in the hospital. She still has a long way to go, but she was able, with the help of a walker, on Friday when I went to see her, to walk out to a garden there at the hospital as we sat down and talked. Do you know that her mom told me, and Eileen actually told me about a week ago, that Sunday, that they had told her that she wouldn't walk again, that she probably wouldn't be going home until December. And they never send somebody home that has ever come down with this walking. Eileen was walking. That Sunday, when I prayed with her and I met with her, she said that was the first day she was able to wiggle the toes on her left foot, that they told her she'd probably never walk again because of that leg. Our God is an awesome God. And He orders and orchestrates events in our lives. After an event that I recently hosted, a young lady came down front and told me and the guest speaker how wonderful the event was and how it encouraged her and how it spoke to her, and she went on her way. I was still there talking to the guest speaker, and a couple of the other chaplains had gathered, and all of a sudden this young lady is back at the front again, and she said, "Excuse me, but I need to say something else." And in an emotional moment, trying to fight back tears, she began to share with us some struggles that she'd been going through and how she felt God was working in her life and kind of the direction that He was taking her in, and she just felt like she needed to say something to us and share that with us. And we thanked her and we encouraged her, and I didn't think anything of it again. The next morning or the next day sometime, I get an email from this young lady. And I want you to listen to the words of her email. She said, "I sincerely apologize for my actions yesterday afternoon. The unprofessional approach towards our distinguished guest was out of line and inappropriate. My motive could not be put into words, but I felt I needed to try. The only thing I understand right now in this lifetime is that there is a larger purpose for me, not of fame or fortune, but just a voice that will speak for those who feel that they have lost their voices. I'm interested in helping others see through the fog." Wow, how amazing is that? But as you think about that, I want you to look again and do you see the spiritual battle that is taking place? Here's a young lady, God is working in her life, telling her that she needs to do something, and the devil is killing her spirit, telling her that she was unprofessional and she was out of line. And that's what our enemy does. He has a way of taking a special moment, and he has a way of twisting it and turning it to make it feel unprofessional, making it feel dirty. Why does he do that? Why does he do that? Because he's trying to keep a child of God from following the steps that God is directing in the believer's life. He did it in her heart, and he does it in our heart each and every day. Do you know how I responded to her? I want you to listen to my email back to her, because I believe with all of my heart somebody in here this morning needs to hear the same encouragement that she needed. I said, "All is good. I don't think anyone felt you were unprofessional or inappropriate. Of course, we're all Christ followers, and we view things differently in situations like yesterday. Another time, another place with other officers, it might have been an issue, but please don't feel bad. We appreciate your passion to find God's direction in your life." Philippians 1:6 says, "Be confident of this," and here's the promise, "that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until Christ Jesus." You are right. God has a purpose for you, and by your faithfulness to His leading, it will be complete. It'll be accomplished. There's another verse that is really the rest of the story of Philippians 1:6, and it's Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10 that says that we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to accomplish which God prepared in advance for us to do. I love that verse in Ephesians. I love that word workmanship. In the Greek, it's the word poema. We get our English word poem from it. And that verse basically says that we are God's literary masterpiece. And that just as a poet labors over every word, every rhyme, every poetic pattern to communicate his message, God did the same thing as he uniquely created you to accomplish his purpose and his desire in your life, in your life. And he worked so hard to create you, Ephesians 2:10, he will make sure that it gets done, Philippians 1:6. Something told you to go back into the auditorium yesterday after you had left us and to speak up. We, those that you felt you were unprofessional to, believe that perhaps, and very likely it was God's Spirit saying, go back and tell them what's on your heart. You had no choice. God's Spirit was burdening you, and you were obedient to it. Maybe God's lesson for you in this divine appointment was maybe it was a test of your obedience. Maybe it was to make a contact. Maybe it was God trying to encourage you. Maybe it wasn't even about you. Maybe someone in that group needed to hear the passion, to see the tears, to hear the story and be encouraged by God because of you. Maybe it was 10 other things I haven't even thought of, but in the end, you were obedient. Now just keep praying to God as Isaiah did. Here I am, God. Send me. And watch what Almighty God will do. You see, the truth that you and I need to understand is that a man's steps are directed of the Lord. I don't fully understand it, but I know it's powerful. It can take you to Afghanistan to learn a lesson about faith that God taught another man in in South Africa years earlier, that led another man in South Africa to go to a bunch of conferences and then years later send him to Afghanistan so that two people from opposite sides of the world, so that their lives could come together for some divine reason. I don't understand it, but it's powerful. A man's steps are directed by the Lord. I don't fully understand it, but it's powerful. It can change humanly designed schedules so that a 17-year-old girl struggling with her faith can find the courage to ask for help because her circumstances are impossible. And then it leads to a special connection that strengthens the faith of the girl. It strengthens the faith of the family and even the chaplain that ministered to her. It's powerful. A man's steps are directed by the Lord. I don't fully understand it, but it's powerful. It can cause a person to change directions, to re-engage in a conversation with people of a higher rank that ought not be interrupted, and boldly share a testimony of personal struggles and a burden that God has laid on her heart to help other people. God is directing the steps of your life. I ask you this morning, are you sensitive to it? Are you learning from it? Are you allowing God to transform your life? Or are you, as the second half of that verse says, trying to understand life on your own apart from God? And here is what is really amazing. Here's the awesome thing. That for somebody, or for somebodies, for somebody this morning, this sermon was a divine appointment. For somebody in here this morning, God directed the steps of your life for you to be here today to hear this message. Maybe you weren't planning on being here. Maybe something else was going on. Maybe things and circumstances in your life brought you here this morning, and this was a message that you had to hear. God ordered your steps. God ordered the steps so that Chris and I, in a unique way 3 years ago, would meet. So that today, I might be here to share this message with you. And there's probably a million other things that God did to orchestrate this time this morning, but for somebody, it is a divine appointment this morning that you are here to hear this message. And I simply, as Dave comes up to play, want to ask you this morning, how are you going to respond? How are you going to respond? Dave's going to play some music in the background, and I'm just going to stand right here. And if that somebody is you, I want you to come down, take me by the hand, and say, God wanted us to meet this morning. Just that simple. If you feel that this morning God has orchestrated the events of your life and that this morning you feel He has placed you here, stand up, take me by the hand, and say, God wanted us to meet so that I can pray for you and we can celebrate this morning. Father God, this morning as Dave plays, God, I pray that you would just move. I know you have ordered our steps this morning to be here. And Father God, we need to respond to your message. Father, whether we do it in our seats, or Father, whether we come down to this altar of prayer and do it, God, we need to respond to you this morning. And God, I truly believe that there's a divine appointment here this morning. And so for the next few seconds, God, we just want to allow those introductions to take place.